One of the empires we explored before is the Habsburg Empire of Charles V. In a previous video, we examined the family tree of the Habsburgs and examined their policy of royal marriages, how they used them as a tool to amass political power. We identified how they were one of the most unique dynasties of history, bringing together variegated regions of Europe, from Spain to Austria to the Low Countries, unifying them under one ruler. We explored how Charles V had the largest inheritance in history, getting the Holy Roman Empire from his grandfather Maximilian, the Low Countries from his grandmother Mary, Castile from his maternal grandmother Isabella, and Aragon from his maternal grandfather Ferdinand. Born in Ghent in modern-day Belgium, the emperor was educated in a cosmopolitan culture. His Flemish upbringing instilled him with Catholic, chivalric, and humanistic values. The challenge of his reign was getting very diverse regions to work together and dealing with the major threats of his time period. To the north of Spain was France, a major power in the 16th century. Charles would fight his peer Francis, the King of France, in the Italian Wars. Meanwhile, Charles faced the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which was expanding rapidly in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, as well as the new heresy of Lutheranism, which was rising in the Holy Roman Empire. As a young ruler, Charles V attempted to mediate the Reformation. Started by Martin Luther, the young emperor granted him protection so he could testify at the Diet of Worms. Refusing to recant his beliefs, Luther became a fugitive, taking shelter with a rebellious prince in the empire. In political terms, Luther's Reformation represented a defiance in Germany against the authority of the emperor. Power devolved to local rulers, undermining Charles's influence there outside of his hereditary lands. At war, Charles would prove successful, defeating the French in Italy and capturing Francis at the Battle of Pavia. He would take Milan and bring the peninsula under Habsburg hegemony.
He would preside over Spain when it fought the Turks in the Mediterranean, and again when Austria defeated them at the Siege of Vienna. These battles marked the limit of Islam's expansion against Europe in the early modern period, showing the emperor's participation in a civilizational struggle.
The emperor would help his brother marry into the monarchies of Bohemia and Hungary, laying the foundation for the Austrian Empire in Central Europe. The emperor would also defeat the Lutherans in Germany, choosing to allow free religion to the Protestants to try to resolve the spiritual conflict. Enriched by gold from the New World, Spain prospered under his rule. However, the reliance on American gold caused the Spanish economy to fail to develop. Spain didn't develop its own merchant, artisan, or educated classes compared to England or Holland. This resulted in its long-term decline relative to the other powers. Though he had many military successes, the scale and sprawling nature of his empire meant he was always on the move, and had little rest his whole reign. Said to be, quote, most desirous of peace and quiet, he was constantly at war. In addition, his health infirmities, including the Habsburg jaw, chronic gout and arthritis, and the stress of having to care for his mother, wore him down. The emperor decided his empire was too big for one person to govern, so he made the decision to split it between the Austrian and Spanish branches. He gave Austria to his brother Ferdinand, who started a new line of the family there, while he gave Spain to his son Philip. The golden age of Spain would continue for one more monarch, the empire reaching its peak under Philip II. However, after him, the inbreeding of the dynasty began to take a toll, before the country declined terribly in the 17th century. As we explored before, the Habsburgs ended in Spain with the death of the hopelessly inbred Charles II. The family would meanwhile continue in Austria until the accession of Maria Theresa and the extinction of the male line. When learning about Charles V, there are a few acts of his that I always found interesting. Pious and humble, I find him one of the most psychologically unique monarchs of history. Embodying a philosophy of benevolent paternalism, he did several symbolic deeds over his reign that I feel exemplify his unique character. Number 1. The duel. During the Italian Wars, Charles V challenged the King of France to a duel. Requesting this duel decide the fate of the war, the emperor invoked medieval ideas of chivalry and archaic ideas of kingship dating back to Agamemnon and Achilles. In this act, we can see the emperor's desire to spare his subjects from suffering, choosing instead to take the conflict on himself. Francis refused, and the war ended up being settled on the battlefield instead. Number 2, the morality of Bartolome de las Casas. When he presided over a debate in Spain over the fate of the Native Americans, Charles sided with those who wanted to protect their rights of life and liberty. He passed a decree preventing their slavery, though their abuse continued in the New World, ignoring the ruling of the emperor. Though he failed, the emperor sided with the moral theologian, Bartolome de las Casas. Number 3, snubbing Cortés. When Hernán Cortés, the conquistador of Mexico and governor of New Spain, sought an audience with the emperor, Charles V snubbed him, saying he was a brigand and a thug. Despite this, the conquistador barged into the emperor's carriage during his visit, imploring him to recognize he had done more to expand the borders of the Spanish Empire than anyone else. This event showed the gentlemanly morality of the emperor, expecting the same principles to be embodied by his subordinates. 4. Picking up Titian's brush. One of the most beautiful acts of Charles V involves a meeting he had with his court painter, Titian. Titian was a Venetian oil painter of the Renaissance who served at the Spanish court. Titian completed several portraits of the emperor while employed by him. In an act of pious humility, on one date the emperor helped Titian by bending down to retrieve one of his brushes, showing that someone even with imperial power might aesthetically see himself as a subject of an artist. 5. Leaning on William's shoulder. When he chose to abdicate, the emperor leaned on William of Orange's shoulder, a practical and political gesture. Not relying on his son for support, the emperor instead chose to rely on one of his most devoted Dutch subjects. Later, during Philip's reign, the Dutch would use this action to give them a kind of divine sanction to begin their revolt against Spain. This act of deference by the paternal emperor was a major event in the formation of the Dutch national consciousness. 6. Retirement in a monastery. After decades of stress from ruling an overstretched empire, Charles V made the decision to abdicate when middle-aged. There was something pious in this extremely rare act, someone stepping down from the authority of a Roman emperor to become a private citizen. Charles V lived the last years of his life in retirement, staying in a monastery, visited occasionally by collaborators from his previous life, and spending time with his dog. Charles V ruled over one of the universal empires of history, achieving through marriage one of the most remarkable feats in the history of politics. He ruled piously and humbly, holding some of the psychological traits of a mystic, and followed a unique philosophy of benevolent paternalism.